All right. Well, I am interested in two things, behavior and development. And development has to be of something. So I study behavior because you can see it and measure it directly. Why focus on behavior? Because it's everything we do. It's why we have brains. It's why we have bodies. And for animals and human infants, behavior is the clearest window that researchers have into perception, cognition, and other psychological processes. All the important action is not in the mind. So sure, artificial intelligence, a computer like Deep Blue has more computational power than even a chess grandmaster. But real behavior is still unmatched by the best AI. So here Kasparov is seeing, doing, and knowing, but he's moving his eyes to look at the chessboard and moving his arms to move the chess pieces. And the computer Deep Blue can't do any of that. And here's another guy typing in the location of Kasparov's chess pieces to tell Deep Blue and then translating the computer's, thoughts into actions to move Deep Blue's chess pieces. And here's Deep Blue just sitting there running its computations. RoboCup is the new AI challenge. The ultimate goal is to build a team of humanoid robots that can beat the World Cup champions. And as you can see, robots are still a long way from winning against human soccer players. Indeed, your average 18-month-old toddler can run circles around the world's most sophisticated robots, or run circles around their caregivers. By 18 months, most toddlers can walk, of course, but they can also detect change in the environment and changing affordances for action. They can modify their ongoing actions to cope with variations in the environment. And they can find alternative means to achieve their goals, like how to get down this steep slope to get to the toys and the caregiver at the other end. And they can do it all without missing a beat. This, you guys, is infant intelligence. In a way, it doesn't much matter which motor behavior you study because most lessons are the same. And so hence the parentheses around walking in the title of this text piece. I focused on walking because it's so basic and fundamental that everyone can understand the lessons. And the critical thing is that walking is a model system for other aspects of development, like talking or thinking, which are clearly psychological skills. Here, I'm going to focus on 7 lessons about studying development using infant walking as a model system. I want to illustrate the costs of doing business as usual and the benefits of a more behavior-driven approach. So I want to talk about what we gain when we use rich, rigorous paradigms and when we record the real-time physiological correlates of behavior and when we study learning in the context of development, why we should embrace complex phenomena rather than oversimplify them, and overcome an adult-centric view rather than just assume it, and why we should test embodied, embedded, enculturated models. And then finally, I'm going to end with a heartfelt statement about the benefits of sharing video. You likely are familiar with infant looking time studies. Looking time, especially violation of expectation, is a popular paradigm for studying infants, but it is not a rich or a rigorous paradigm. So what makes a paradigm rich? A paradigm is rich when each participant can spontaneously produce a variety of known behaviors, but also undocumented behaviors, things you'd never expected or seen before. And that suite of behaviors can provide converging evidence about your question. It can inform on multiple psychological domains. And the behaviors can support both hypothesis-driven and discovery science. We can learn new things we hadn't even intended to ask about. What makes a paradigm rigorous is when you can say something definitive about individual participants. When your conclusions about individuals can't be due to chance. And this requires a lot of data, requires a lot of trials per participant per condition. Psychophysics is one of the most rigorous paradigms in psychology because you can estimate a function. It's like an S-shaped curve that links a change in behavior with a change in the environment. And you can do it for each individual in your study in each condition based on dozens of trials per baby. Looking time is the most popular paradigm for studies of infant cognition, and the most popular looking time paradigms are visual habituation or a violation of expectation. But these looking time paradigms are neither rich nor rigorous. Researchers are not analyzing infants' rich patterns of visual exploration. Looking time paradigms are not eye tracking, and researchers can't draw conclusions about individual babies. The visual cliff is a really rich paradigm for studying human infants and other animals. So this thing is a glass-covered drop-off, and babies will spontaneously emit a variety of approach behaviors and crossing strategies and information gathering behaviors, and they'll show different emotional expressions and different kinds of social referencing behaviors. So researchers can use this paradigm to test depth perception or exploration or perception of affordances or social interaction, or to ask about the child's neurological status. And the paradigm also speaks to common sense reasoning about objects, places, and agency. But the visual cliff is not a rigorous paradigm because after one trial, babies learn that the glass makes this thing perfectly safe. So all the results have to be at the group level. You're talking about the percent of infants and group averages. You can't say anything about individuals. An alternative paradigm that taps into the same richness of behaviors is to use continually adjustable apparatuses. In my lab, for example, we test infants on bridges or drop-offs or slopes or gaps or ledges or apertures that babies, squeeze through, or apertures that they reach through, and overhead barriers and underfoot barriers, and so on and so on. We use a psychophysical procedure to estimate an affordance function for each infant in each condition at each session. This figure shows data from one 14-month-old walking over bridges. The affordance function is what the infant can actually do. So here, whether walking is actually possible. The function is calculated based on successful and failed attempts. So here, the affordance threshold is about 24 centimeters. That means half the time, if the baby attempts to walk over a 24-centimeter bridge, he's going to succeed, and half the time he's going to fail. Here's the same infant's motor decisions relative to the affordance threshold. So we calculate the decision function, what infants decide to do based on their attempts and their refusals to attempt the target action. That vertical line at 24 is the affordance threshold, and the blue triangles are this infant's attempts to walk over bridges that are narrower and wider than the threshold. And this baby pretty much perceives possibilities for action because he's matching his attempts to walk to the actual probability of success. This procedure allows us to normalize our assessment of motor decisions relative to each particular threshold. And this is crucial because affordances differ widely among infants, even at the same age. And I'm going to give you an example. This thing here is an adjustable bridge apparatus. So wide bridges afford walking, but narrow bridges are impossible. And the bridges could span a really large 71-centimeter drop-off. That's about at infant's eye height. or a small 17-centimeter drop-off, which is about an infant's knee height. In previous work on real cliffs and slopes and gaps, the probability of falling and the severity of the potential fall were confounded because the higher the drop-off, the higher the probability of falling, and the greater the severity of the potential fall. So here we disentangled the probability of falling from the severity of a potential fall by testing babies crossing wide and narrow bridges over large and small drop-offs. Now, only bridge width affects the possibility of walking, but only drop-off height affects the severity of a potential fall. The affordance thresholds were the same in both drop-off conditions, so that shows that indeed the height of the drop-off didn't change the actual possibilities for walking. Here's the data. 0 here represents the narrowest bridge that each infant could navigate. So the data are normalized to each infant's ability. The positive numbers are bridges wider than the threshold, so these are safe. The negative numbers are bridges narrower than the threshold. They're risky. And there was a really, really narrow 2-centimeter bridge and a really easy, wide 50-centimeter bridge. There's 2 things to notice about this figure. 14-month-olds are responding adaptively to bridge width, the factor that affects the affordances for walking. So they're attempting to walk over safe bridges, but not risky ones. But there's no difference between the large and small drop-off conditions. And we get the same results if we use within and between subject designs, and we get the same results with walking infants and with crawling infants. Their latency to walk and exploratory touching were geared to the bridge width, but infants showed no differences between the large and small drop-off conditions. Likewise, babies took more walking steps and longer time to cross and turned sideways more frequently to walk over narrower bridges, but they showed no differences between the large and small drop-offs. Let me show you what it looks like. So babies ran straight over wide bridges, but they inched their way slowly across narrow bridges, taking lots of tiny steps and turning their bodies sideways to minimize their step width. With our wonderful collaborators at Oregon State, we now use computer vision to identify infants' feet in each video frame, and then we calculate gait parameters while they're approaching the bridge, while they're walking across it, and once they get off it. So on wide bridges, where infants are running straight across, we can see that they're taking long, evenly spaced steps. But on narrow bridges, infants are modifying their gait during approach, and then they're inching their way across the bridge, taking tiny sideways steps, and then a great big step to get off the bridge onto the landing platform. So at every step, they're actually planning and modifying their gait. What are the benefits of rich, rigorous paradigms? Well, you get converging evidence about multiple domains and the possibility of making new discoveries. Since I started this stuff 30 years ago, I had never seen evidence that infants were afraid of heights. But with these bridge studies, we discovered that infants are not taking the severity of a fall into account. Like, they perceive if they're going to fall, so they're perceiving affordances, but they're treating falling from a large and small drop-off the same. That means they're not taking the penalty for errors into account. And this is really strong evidence that babies are not afraid of heights. Behavior involves the body, the brain, and the environment. Video is the best tool for capturing the richness and complexity of behavior and the subtle details of the surrounding context. But multiple recording instruments give additional insights into the details of behavior. And by recording the real-time physiological and neural correlates of behavior, we can better understand the mechanisms that are guiding behavior. Here's an example of a rich, rigorous paradigm using simultaneous recording instruments to capture complex behaviors and its physiological concomitants. We have third-person video that captures the entire scene from 3 camera views. Head-mounted eye tracking recorded where participants looked. Wireless EEG recorded concurrent neural differentiation, and a motion tracker recorded their hand trajectories. The experiment was about motor planning during tool use. So if adults use a hammer and the handle's pointing toward their dominant hand, their habitual overhand grip leads to efficient tool use. But if the handle points to their non-dominant hand, the habitual overhand grip is no good. They have to use an underhand grip that leads to efficient, comfortable tool use. So they have to flip their hand over so it's in a good position for the final action. We tested adults and 3 to 5-year-old children. All of them had non-habitual trials where the underhand grip was most efficient, interspersed with habitual trials where their usual overhand grip was most efficient. Young children are great in the habitual condition with the overhand grip, but they're not so good in the non-habitual condition where they need to switch to an underhand grip. Like they know they're in an awkward position to hammer, but they haven't incorporated a plan for their final action into their initial grip. And all the while they're emitting these kind of complex, rich, beautiful behaviors. Adults nearly uniformly use the adaptive underhand grip. Some children also do. They're adaptive, just like adults. But many children do not. Some non-adaptive children switch and, from trial to trial between habitual and non-habitual grips. And some never use an underhand grip. So what's up with these guys who seem to know that on some trials they need to change their grip, but on other trials they don't know it? Are the adaptive and non-adaptive children's underhand grips really the same? On many trials, when the non-adaptive children used an underhand grip, they changed the trajectory of their movement at the last moment. So they started out with the habitual overhand movement, and then, while their hand was in motion, gathered information that guided their future actions. So even when non-adaptive children used underhand grips, they began planning too late. Head-mounted eye tracking revealed what information participants gathered and when. Using head-mounted eye tracking, we recorded children's visual attention starting from the moment that the screen lifted. From screen lifting to movement onset, adults kept their eyes on the prize, so all their visual attention focused on the hammer. Adaptive children's visual attention was more dispersed, but their hotspot of fixation still the hammer. Non-adaptive children are just looking all over the scene. Each symbol on this graph is one participant's average over dozens and dozens of non-habitual trials. The hammer is the most informative and predictive thing in the scene for planning future action, and the data are showing the latency to the first fixation on the hammer after the screen opens. Adults are the fastest to look at the hammer, then the adaptive children, and the non-adaptive children are the slowest to gather information about the orientation of the hammer. After gathering visual information, participants need to process the information. So we used EEG to index whether and when participants differentiated the orientation of the hammer. This graph shows the difference in readiness potential between the habitual and non-habitual conditions. Readiness potential is a neural correlate of action planning. The dashed line indicates movement onset. The solid line is the average onset of neural differentiation, and the light gray regions show a significant difference between the conditions. So adults differentiate the orientation of the hammer almost immediately, long before the movement onset. Like adults, adaptive children also differentiate the orientation of the hammer before movement onset, but it happens much later than it does in adults. And non-adaptive children never differentiate the orientation of the hammer. We used motion tracking to record the trajectory of the arm when participants first began moving. The difference in movement trajectories between the habitual and non-habitual conditions begins earlier in adults than in adaptive children, and it never differentiates in non-adaptive children. So planning is a kind of real-time cascade of perceptual, neural, and motor events. The x-axis here is from the time the moment that the screen opened. This is in milliseconds. Everything happens super, super fast. Adults were the earliest to fixate the hammer, and non-adaptive children fixated last. Adults showed earlier neural differentiation of the handle orientation than adaptive children. Non-adaptive children never showed neural differentiation at all. Adults began moving sooner than children, and adults showed earlier differentiation of their movement trajectories compared to adaptive children. Non-adaptive children showed no movement differentiation at all. What are the benefits of multiple recording instruments to capture rich behavior and its physiological real-time correlates? There's evidence that motor planning involves a real-time cascade of events, from perceptual exploration to neural processing to then motor action. Exploratory movements generate information for perception, but you need to know to explore. So it's sort of a planning to plan. So in locomotion, movements are big and slow, and generally obstacles are at a distance. So there's loads of time, literally several seconds, to modify gait and gather additional perceptual information. But looking before you reach is a different problem, because manual actions are small and they're fast and the targets are close by. So you have to get your eyes on the target before your hand starts to move. For manual actions, planning has to happen in milliseconds. And one final word about using behavior to make inferences about cognition. You've just seen amazing behaviors in toddlers and preschoolers, but the repertoire of neonates and young children is much more limited, and very young children can't tolerate long experiments or lots of trials. So researchers typically rely on very simple behaviors, typically for only a single trial or only a few trials. The reasoning goes something like this. Infants emit behavior. So for example, they move their eyes, maybe to look at a display, and they move their facial muscles, maybe to imitate an adult model, and they move their limbs, maybe in response to a stimulus, or maybe to reach for a target. Researchers then use those behaviors to make inferences about infant cognition, about imitation, or knowledge of morality, or numerosity, or agency, and so on. But how does cognition turn into the movements? It could go through cortex, but then motor cortex, M1, would need to be producing and controlling the motor outflow. Now, cortex is not required to produce movements. Fetuses can move their body parts, just like adults can move their body parts without M1 involvement. But where is infant cognition without cortical motor outflow? Without cortical motor outflow, cognition is subcortical. This is a highly simplified circuit diagram of motor control of the limbs and face. There's a similar diagram and a similar story for control of the eyes. Regardless of whether subcortical or cortical structures speak to M1, there's no evidence that M1 produces movement in baby rats, in kittens, or in human infants younger than 3 months of age. Motor cortex has a long, protracted development, and it slowly becomes the M1 that we all know and love, somewhere between 3 and 12 months or so in humans. The protracted development of motor cortex has really important implications for understanding the development of infant intelligence. It means there's no evidence of cortically mediated core knowledge. That is, there's no evidence of developmental continuity between what researchers infer about cognition based on behavior in neonates in young infants and what cognition means for an older child or adult. So whatever the substrate mediating the movements in the neonate or young infant, if those movements are reliable, it's not the same substrate that mediates cognition in older children and adults. All right, infants learn in the context of development. The input for learning depends on the immediate developmental context. It depends on baby's access to the environment. Infants' growth is dramatic and it's episodic. Babies can grow nearly 2 centimeters in height in a single day. And their motor skills also change dramatically, especially for posture and locomotion. How children can move affects their potential access to the environment, what they see and what they touch and where they go. It affects their visual, manual, and whole body access to the environment. So as behavior is developing, the environment is developing in tandem. A nice example is the transition from crawling to walking. Walking literally brings more of the world into view. Walking gives infants a better vantage point because of how the head connects to the human torso. While crawling, the head naturally points down, but while walking, the head points forward. For crawlers to position their head forward, they would have to crank their heads up, extend their necks as far as their neck can go. Here's crawling infants' view of the world. While babies are crawling, their head points down, not forward, so they see mostly the floor in front of their hands. But in a walking posture, the entire room is visible. With our wonderful collaborators at Oregon State, we're precisely quantifying infants' changing environment and their changing opportunities for learning. We're testing how growth of infants' bodies and skills changes their visual, manual, and whole body access to the environment. The study's longitudinal, so infants come each month from 2 to 18 months of age. And we use computer vision and machine learning to track babies' location, their posture, and their field of view so that we can estimate, essentially each pixel in this structured room that they touch with their eyes and their hands and their body. And it's all video-based. There's nothing on the baby. All the analyses are based only from third-person video. This is a video of what the playroom looks like. So it always starts like this at every session for every baby. It's a large, rich play space filled with surfaces and objects on the walls. There's pictures and activity centers and shelves of toys. On the ground, there's surfaces that vary in friction and rigidity. On the ceiling, there's lights and cameras and beams, and the room is filled with objects, including lots of good toys. And there's a big barrier that occludes view of half the room unless you get up and move around it. At every session, we place babies down on their backs in exactly the same place on that gridded mat, and the caregiver sits in that chair and is occupied on their phone. And then babies have 10 minutes to do whatever they want to do. When babies are really young, they can't even get off their backs. So for the entire 10 minutes, they just lay there on the mat. When they can sit up and sort of scooch around for a few steps, their access to the environment expands. They can explore the mat and nearby objects, but they still can't see half the room. When they can crawl and pull to a stand, they can get off the mat and explore larger space in the playroom and access a lot more different objects and toys. And when babies can walk, they can go everywhere in the room. They go more, they see more, and they do more. We have 8 camera views to ensure that the infant is always visible on at least 2 cameras. Here I've zoomed in to 1 camera view so you can see what's actually happening. This example is just 8 seconds from one baby's 10-minute video. So the baby starts out standing upright, playing with that busy box green alligator thing. And then the baby walks across the room and bends down to play with that little pink pig. Using computer vision, we locate the baby in each camera view and do 3D pose estimation. And we render the room in 3 dimensions. So this now is a rendering. This is not a video. With a rendering, we can manipulate the room so we can see it from every angle at every moment. We can analyze every visual, manual, and whole body contact with the environment with centimeter precision. We know where everything is. Then based on pose estimation of the infant's head orientation, we can project a cone from the baby's face until it hits a solid surface like the ceiling or the wall or the floor. So we can quantify how much of the surface is, like touched visually, and we can quantify every object in that visual cone. Here's the history of visual access. This is just for 8 seconds. Using these computer vision tools, we can precisely quantify the amount, the history, and the time series of visual, manual, and whole body access at every time point. And we can do that with no recording device on the baby. So it's kind of cool. Behavior develops in a changing body with changing skills in a changing world. Bodies and skills constrain interactions with the environment, and it also filters information from the environment. Because bodies and skills develop, the environment also develops. As Gomez, Marin, and Gazafar put it in their beautiful paper that they titled The Life of Behavior, they wrote, all animals share a common world, but not all animals have a world in common. All right, researchers typically simplify walking, so they're not actually studying real walking. Researchers study pre-walking babies while they take steps on a motorized treadmill. And after infants can walk independently, researchers study them in a simplified lab task where babies take continual forward steps along a straight path. In this case, they're walking over an instrumented floor that records the timing and placement of each footstep. And of course, no researcher thinks that infants really walk only in continual straight paths. We simplify walking for practical reasons. The technologies limit movements to a small designated recording area. And conceptually, the simplified task allows comparisons across infants and across development. The simplified task shows a robust developmental progression in walking skill from novice infants to adults. The problem is that infants don't want to take continual forward steps along a straight path. Instead, they wander in and out of the recording area. They stagger and swerve and fall and do other stuff like sit down or dance off the carpet or try to take off their diaper. And even when babies get to the end of the path, they're not always doing it in a straight line. Sometimes infants have other goals entirely. Typically, researchers throw away more walking data than they analyze. So researchers want this, so they throw away this. And they throw away this. And we throw away this. It turns out that with a large instrumented floor, we can record and quantify natural gait, just like in the traditional simplified task. So if the floor is instrumented, babies just play and the floor records their footsteps. And then later, we can process the behaviors. So we're opportunistically measuring their gait during natural walking. It's the same parameters, except it's for natural gait, real gait during real walking, instead of artificial gait, and that's traditional straight path task. Gait during free play shows the same pattern of development as gait in the simplifying task. step length increases with walking experience, step width decreases with walking experience. And the gait measures during free play actually validate the straight path task. So individual differences in walking skill are stable across the two tasks. But more important than all that, the simplified task loses critical features of the phenomenon, because it turns out that relatively few paths are straight. Only 25% are straight. 75% of infants' paths are curved, and there's curved paths across development. That means from the very first week of walking, the two sides of the body are doing different things. They're not doing the same thing. And that's what it means to learn to walk. Natural walking is more about starting and stopping, not taking continual steps. So watch this baby's right foot. She's just standing there, and then she takes a single step, and that's it. That's the whole walking bout. Short bouts are common across development. More than 30% of bouts have only 1 or 2 or 3 steps. Babies can take longer bouts, and they often do, but a lot of the time it's only 1 or 2 or 3 steps. Each of these little starts and stops means that infants are generating disequilibrium, and then they're regaining equilibrium. That's what they're practicing. Most of infants' bouts contain steps that are not forward at all. Their steps are omnidirectional. So I'm going to play it again at half speed so you can really see what I mean. This baby takes 1, 2 sideways steps, and then 1, 2, 3 forward steps, and then 1, 2, 3 backward steps. Less than 20% of bouts are only forward steps. Most are a mixture of forward and not forward steps, or no forward steps at all. And that's true across development. That means that omnidirectional steps are not a characteristic of poor walking skill. Instead, infants are deliberately initiating disequilibrium in all directions. And all of those little variable bouts add up. This graph shows the accumulated number of steps per hour plotted against days of walking. Each symbol is one infant's spontaneous walking in a lab playroom that's set up with toys and elevations. Infants average 2,400 steps per hour. That's like 14,000 steps per day. And we see the same thing in new samples of infants tested in a lab playroom that's set up with different toys and different elevations and different configurations. And we see the same thing when we record walking in infants' homes, and we see the same thing in new studies of natural activity in the home. What's the cost of simplifying a complex phenomenon like walking? Well, there's tremendous data loss, and there's also loss of the phenomenon. What's the cost of studying walking and all its complexity? None. You can collect the same measures with no data loss and have happy babies. And there's an even bigger benefit because you can gain new insights into how babies learn to walk and how they don't. The development of walking is all about variability. It's not about doing the same thing over and over. Developmental science is too often based on our adult-centric assumptions about what babies should do and should think and should feel. I mean, we're adults, we're adult researchers, so it's hard to not be adult-centric. So we think things like adults prefer efficiency, so babies should too. Adults hate errors, so babies should too, blah, blah, blah. But what if it's not true? What if it's not true? Is infant locomotion really efficient and goal-directed? Well, what instigates locomotion in the first place? On the adult-centric view, infants should walk for the same reasons we do, to go to people and places and things that we see or that we know about. And of course, babies can walk to goals that they view from a distance. If you put a baby on a raised walkway with a goal at the other end, they're going to go to it. But do they really do that? To study whether where infants look influences where they go, we fitted infants with head-mounted eye trackers. If infants really move to go to destinations, they should look at something while they're stationary and then go to it. Like the stationary infant sees that ball on the green block and then just walks straight to the ball. Turns out such destination-directed bouts are pretty rare. It's like 18% of their bouts. It's also possible that infants discover something while they're traveling around. So the baby, just starts moving and is looking at whatever, and like maybe sees something like that saxophone and then sees something else like the green alligator. And then that becomes a sort of found goal. But discovery bouts are also rare. What's happening the rest of the time? The infant starts out looking all over and then starts moving, and nobody knows why, and then moves a little bit and then just stops moving in the middle of the floor, beyond arm's reach of any recognizable person, place, or thing. Most of babies' bouts don't involve a destination at all. They're not going toward any recognizable destination. Whatever. We figured if it's really true that objects are not needed to instigate locomotion, then infants should move just as much in an empty room as in a room that's filled with toys. So we observed infants playing in a room that was filled with toys, actually toys designed to elicit locomotion, and compared their locomotion to infants in the same room with all the toys removed. We find infants walk just as much in an empty room as in a room filled with toys, so they spend the same amount of time in motion. They take the same number of steps per hour, and they travel the same distance per hour. And infants in both conditions go to the same low percentage of destinations, around 30%. In the toy room, infants mostly went to toys. In the empty room, they went to their caregivers or features of the room like doorknobs or walls or carpet on the floor. Most of the time, 70% of the time, they're just running around. What differs is that infants in the toy room spend less time near their caregiver, and infants in the toy room explore more of the playroom. The differences are really clear when you look at individual infants' paths. These are paths from one baby in the toy room and one in the no toy room. The black dot is the caregiver. Two infants took similar number of steps, but they covered really different amounts of area. Infants in the toy room travel all over, but infants in the no toy room repeat their paths. Here's all of the infants' paths ordered by the amount of area covered. Babies in the toy-filled room cover more area in the same amount of steps. The cost of an adult-centric view is that we misinterpret the data and build superfluous theories. Of course, infants can take straight, efficient paths to a goal, but often they do not. Of course, babies can move to goals, but when left to their own choices, they mostly move with no goal in sight and no goal in mind. My second example is falling. When adults fall, this is a high impact error, especially in older adults. Common sense from an adult-centric view would suggest that errors shape learning, that negative reward shapes learning. But babies fall all the time. Infant walking is filled with errors. They fall while they're playing. They trip over their own feet. They fall when they try to sit down. They fall when they try to stand back up. Babies fall all the time. On average, infants fall 40 times for every hour in locomotion. That means falling is part of their daily life. It's a substantial part of the natural input when they're learning to move. They fall a lot, but they don't care, and their parents don't care. Infants' everyday falls are so trivial that they rarely fuss, and caregivers rarely show concern. 91% of falls, that's that big green bar, they're uneventful and largely go unmarked. Infants are back at play right away. Even after a big fall, this baby is back at play within 3 seconds. On average, infants recover from their falls within 2 seconds. Moreover, infants don't decrease their walking or stay away from the objects or places in the room that were associated with their falls. This baby fell 15 times with this pink stroller, but the falls didn't discourage her from walking with the stroller. Across babies, they walk just as much after each fall as before each fall. An important factor that mitigates the impact of falling is the size and shape and composition of infants' bodies. Babies are short and they're low to the ground and they're padded with baby fat, so they move slowly. Babies are built to fall. The potential energy that's generated by an infant fall is 18 times less than if babies were adult-sized and walked at adult speeds. Contrary to the adult-centric view, infant falls are low impact. Typical infant falls are trivial and go unmarked by babies and their caregivers. Infants' bodies mitigate the impact forces so that infants are not discouraged by falling from obtaining immense amounts of practice. A system that allows frequent, low-impact errors encourages beginners to keep practicing to the point of mastery. Babies learn to walk and to do everything that babies learn to do, embodied in a body that's growing and changing, embedded in a physical environment that's also growing and changing, and enculturated in a social environment that's filled with other people. Formal modelers like AI researchers might not be able to simulate a developing body and environment, but they certainly can simulate an embodied, embedded, enculturated system. For example, to test whether all the crazy variability in infant walking is actually a good way to learn, we taught simulated robots to walk using real infant data. This is a simulated robot in Peter Stone's lab being trained to walk different paths. The success of the training is evaluated with robot soccer. Why soccer? Because it's kind of like real life. It's unpredictable and novel and variable, and there's other active agents and there's goals. In tournament 1, we asked how training robots on geometric paths would compare to training robots on real baby paths. Training in a straight line is kind of like treadmill training or walking in that simplified straight path task. The short answer is babies win. Across 1,000 matches between each pair of teams, babies show the largest average goal difference. In tournament 2, we used machine learning to cluster 75 infants' paths into 5 groups based on the variability of their walking in terms of the path shape and the path direction and the path length and the number of starts and stops. The purple team was the most varied on all the measures. Tournament 2 showed that more varied experience leads to better functional consequences. It leads to more wins in 1,000 head-to-head matches of RoboCup. So variety is good, but it turns out it's not good enough. You have to pair a varied training regimen with a low penalty for error, because that's how babies learn foundational skills like walking. When we tested robots' skill acquisition on the same walking path that they were trained on, we found that a lower penalty leads to better walking performance. Robots that were trained with 0 penalty for falling walked the farthest on the paths that they were trained on. And when we tested the robot's skill transfer on a novel, untrained path, we found that the robots that were trained with 0 penalty for falling walked the farthest on untrained paths. So a low penalty for errors is better for skill acquisition on trained paths, but also for skill transfer on novel, untrained paths. It's possible to test formal models that are embodied, embedded, and enculturated, just like real animals and real babies. are simulated. Robots suggest that infants' natural training measurement is optimal for learning. Immense amounts of time-distributed, varied practice leads to flexible, functional behavior. And errors like falling are discounted. They're not treated like a negative reward, so that babies are not dissuaded from practicing their new skills to the point of mastery. Learning is coming from positive feedback. And I want to end with a few words about video data sharing and reuse. So I'm leading a project to build the community and cyber infrastructure for the open sharing of video data among behavioral scientists. And that's where Databrary comes in. Databrary is a web-based library for research videos. That's why we call it Databrary. It's designed for the secure, ethical, open sharing of research video. Video uniquely demonstrates procedures and findings. You can see exactly what researchers did and how participants responded, and that will increase research transparency and reproducibility. This whole presentation used video as demonstration. Video data are uniquely suited for reuse, so you could ask questions that go beyond the scope of the original study, questions the original researchers had never even imagined. And Databrary manages and preserves videos indefinitely. As of last week, Databrary had 1,616 authorized investigators from 729 institutions around the globe and was serving up 102,000 hours of shared video. To capitalize on the richness of video, you need tools. So we created the DataView tool for human annotation of video, DataView time locks, user-defined codes to their location in the video. This DataView software is offered free and openly to researchers. You could also use machine learning to annotate video, for example, to track people's movements. And you can use machine learning to pick out objects in the scene. All right, what are the benefits of video recording, video annotation, video sharing, and video reuse? I think it's pretty huge because it's increased transparency and reproducibility and the chance to speed up scientific progress. So please go register on Databrary. And let me sum it all up. There's really only one big lesson from infants. We have the paradigms and the tools and the technology and the infrastructure to really understand behavior and its development. We've just got to do it. So thanks.